He said it on a Wednesday morning in late September, standing at the door of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands and sawdust still on his boots, watching her erase the chalkboard with the kind of unhurried efficiency that made everything she did look inevitable. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't thought about it even once on the walkover. It came out the way honest things do sometimes, before the careful part of a person can get in the way. You know, Miss Hadley, whoever ends up with you is going to be the luckiest man in the Alberta territory. He expected her to laugh. He expected the polite deflection that sensible women give to comments like that. A small smile, a change of subject, the graceful sidestep that lets everyone breathe again. Instead, she stopped erasing. Her hand stayed flat against the board. A moment passed. Then she turned, and her expression was something he had not seen on her before. Not quite afraid, not quite decided. Something in between, like a person standing at a threshold, weighing the cost of stepping through. "I was hoping you might think so," she said quietly. "About yourself, I mean." The chalk dust settled in the morning light. Outside, a magpie called once and went silent. Jonas Whitmore was 31 years old and had been building things in Dunmore, Alberta for the better part of a decade. He'd come west from Ontario at 22 with $200, a good set of tools, and the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided to stop waiting for his life to arrange itself. He built the feed store first, then the post office addition, then half the houses on the east side of town. He was known for doing what he said he would do and not much else. He was not a complicated man, and he would have told you so himself if you'd had asked. What he did not have, and had quietly stopped thinking about, was anyone to come home to. His house on the edge of the Whitmore property was solid and well-made and almost entirely silent. Kathleen Hadley had arrived in Dunmore 3 years earlier from Winnipeg, sent west by a school board that needed teachers more than it needed reasons to be careful about who they sent. She was 27, unmarried, and had a letter of reference from her previous school that described her as exceptionally capable and entirely self-sufficient, which was the kind of praise that told you everything about the woman and nothing comfortable about the man who wrote it. She taught the children of Dunmore from September through June in a single-room schoolhouse that she had repainted herself the first summer she arrived, because the previous shade of gray made the children look ill. The school board had not authorized the paint. She had not asked them to. By the time anyone noticed, the building was a clean, pale yellow, and 3 parents had separately told the board it was an improvement, so the matter was dropped. Kathleen was good at her work the way some people are good at breathing, without apparent effort, without needing to be told. She knew which children were hungry before lunch, and which ones were frightened of being wrong, and she arranged her classroom accordingly. She was patient, but not soft. She had a dry sense of humor that the older students caught, and the younger ones didn't, and a quality of stillness when she listened that made people feel they had been genuinely heard, which is rarer than it should be. Jonas had known her for 3 years. He had spoken to her at church suppers, at the spring fair, at the various civic gatherings that small towns manufacture as excuses to see one another. He had eaten at the Hadley boarding house table when Mrs. Doyle invited him for Sunday dinner, and Kathleen happened to be there. He had thought, in a vague and unexamined way, that the school had done well to get her. He had not, until that particular September, understood what he was actually looking at. The schoolhouse roof had been leaking since August. 2 of the cedar shingles on the north face had lifted in a summer storm, and the school board had been discussing the repair at its meetings with the focused inaction of a body that prefers consensus to decisions. By mid-September, with the first rains coming and Kathleen having placed a bucket under the leak without saying a word to anyone, Jonas heard about it from the blacksmith, went to look at the roof himself on a Tuesday, and showed up Wednesday morning with lumber and his tools. He hadn't been asked. He just came. Kathleen had been at the chalkboard when he knocked on the doorframe. The children were gone. It was just past 4 o'clock. The last of them had left 20 minutes earlier. She'd turned and looked at him standing there with his toolbox and said, "The board hasn't approved that yet." "I know," he said. "It's raining Thursday." She had looked at him for a moment. "Then there's tea on the stove if you want it when you're done." He fixed the roof in under 2 hours. She brought him tea in a tin mug without being asked. They talked for 20 minutes in the thin September light about nothing much. The coming harvest. Whether the Connolly family's eldest would be ready for the territorial examinations, the price of flour at the co-op. Then he picked up his toolbox and left. He was almost to the road when he turned back. He wasn't sure why. He just did, and then he said what he said. And she said what she said, and he drove home in the September dusk thinking about it for a long time. The town of Dunmore held its harvest supper on the second Friday of October. It was the kind of event that anchored the year in a place like that. Tables set up in the church hall, every family bringing something, the older men arguing about the wheat yield in one corner, while the older women discussed everything else with considerably more accuracy. It mattered. It was the town taking stock of itself before winter came and made everything harder. Jonas arrived to find Kathleen already there, helping Mrs. Doyle arrange the dessert table with the easy competence of someone who has done this many times and doesn't need to be told where anything goes. She was wearing a dark green dress he hadn't seen before. Her hair was up. She was laughing at something Mrs. Doyle had said. 4 men spoke to her before the meal was even laid out. Jonas counted and then told himself he hadn't been counting. He sat near the far end of the table and ate his supper and talked to Edgar Price about fence posts, which was genuinely interesting to neither of them, but filled the time adequately. Afterward, he helped stack chairs, and on the walk home across the dark field, he thought about what she had said to him in the schoolhouse. "I was hoping you might think so, about yourself, I mean." He had turned it over a dozen times in 2 weeks, and still wasn't entirely sure what he was supposed to do with it. It wasn't an invitation exactly. It wasn't a declaration. It was more like a door left open, not flung wide, just unlatched, waiting to see if he had the sense to push through. He stopped walking. The stars were out above the Alberta plains, enormous and indifferent. A light was still on in the boarding house window across the field. He stood there in the cold for a while, thinking about a woman who repainted schoolhouses without permission, and brought tea to men fixing roofs without being asked, and answered honest things honestly when she had every reason not to. He went home, but he thought about it all night. October came properly then, the kind of Alberta October that means business, frost on the ground by morning, the aspens going gold all at once like someone had made a decision about it. Jonas had a barn extension to finish for the McLeod family before the snow, and he worked long days out there, but he found himself going out of his way on the road, home past the schoolhouse, more often than the route required. Once he stopped to fix the gate on the schoolyard fence that had been dragging on the ground since August. He had a hinge in his toolbox that fit. It took 12 minutes. He didn't mention it to anyone. 2 days later, he saw Kathleen on the road outside the post office, and she said, "Someone fixed the gate." Not a question. He said, "Hinge was worn." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read, and then said, "Thank you," in a way that was simple and direct and meant more than those 2 words usually do. The following week, old Reverend Alcott, not the young one, the older one who had been in Dunmore since before anyone could remember, stopped Jonas after the Sunday service and told him without particular preamble that he was a man of evident good sense in most things and considerably less sense in others, and that the latter category appeared to include a specific schoolteacher. "I don't know what you mean," Jonas said. Reverend Alcott looked at him the way very old men look at younger ones who are being deliberately obtuse. "Yes, you do," he said, and walked away. On the walk home, Jonas thought about that, and about the roof, and the gate, and the tea in the tin mug, and the Thursday it rained exactly as he'd said it would, and hadn't touched the schoolroom floor because the shingles were fixed. He had begun without quite meaning to arrange small things so that they worked out better for her. He didn't announce this. He wouldn't have known how to explain it. It just seemed obvious, the way some things do once you've seen them clearly. Her life was harder than it needed to be in certain fixable ways, and he knew how to fix things. That was when he understood what had been happening to him since September. It arrived not as a shock, but as a recognition, the way you recognize a word in a language you didn't know you'd learned. It was a Wednesday again. Jonas had begun to think Wednesdays were doing something deliberate. He was replacing a board on the church hall step. It had gone soft, and Mrs. Doyle's husband had nearly gone through it the week before. When Kathleen came past on her way from the school, students gone, the last of the afternoon light going orange over the grain elevators. She stopped. "You're everywhere lately," she said, not accusingly. More like a woman noting a pattern she hasn't decided what to do with yet. "Things need fixing," he said. "They do," she agreed. She set her bag down on the step he hadn't gotten to yet and sat on it without ceremony. "How's the McLeod barn coming?" "Done Friday, that's fast. I've had practice." They talked for 20 minutes in the October cold, and Jonas discovered again, as he had at the supper, as he had at the schoolhouse, what genuinely good company she was. She was funny without trying to be, in that quiet, sideways way. A dry observation delivered without fanfare that you were still thinking about an hour later. She had a habit of going very still when she was thinking something through, and then saying it plainly when she'd decided, with no hedging. She told him about a student, a boy named Frank Jessup, 11 years old, had been falling behind for 2 months. She'd figured out last week that he couldn't see the chalkboard clearly and had written to the boy's parents herself, out of pocket, to arrange spectacles from the catalog. "The board won't pay for it," she said. "It wasn't a complaint. Just a fact, delivered and filed." "You paid for them yourself," Jonas said. "It's a pair of spectacles," she said. "He's 11. Jonas looked at her. "What?" she said, he said, but he was thinking, this is what she does. Quietly, without announcement. She just fixes things. He went home that evening and stood in his kitchen for a while. Thinking he realized, been a man who stopped wanting things directly a long time ago. Not because nothing had been worth wanting, but because wanting directly meant the possibility of losing directly, and he had learned early what that cost. His father, who had left when Jonas was 12, a woman in Ontario, years ago, who had chosen someone with better prospects and been correct to do so. A kind of learned quietness about the things that mattered most, a habit of keeping them at a distance where they couldn't hurt as much. He had not, until Kathleen Hadley, noticed that the habit had gone on too long. He stood in his kitchen for 10 minutes. Then he put his coat on and walked to the boarding house. Mrs. Doyle answered the door and told him, with a look that suggested she had been expecting this for some time, that Kathleen was in the sitting room. She offered him tea with the cheerfulness of a woman who considers herself to have played a small role in what is happening and doesn't intend to miss any of it. Kathleen looked up from her marking when he came in. She didn't seem surprised. She set her pen down. "Jonas," she said, "I want to say something," he said. "All right." He sat down across from her, and because he was a man who said things plainly when he finally said them, he said, "I've been thinking about the schoolhouse, what you said." "I know," she said. "I'm slow," he said. "You are," she agreed, without any unkindness. "But you fix things. I've noticed that about you." He looked at her. The lamp was on behind her. Her marking was spread across the table. Red pen, careful notations in the margins, 32 children whose work she carried home every night. "I'd like to come calling properly," he said, "if you're willing." She considered this for a moment, not to make him wait. He understood that about her already. She considered things before she answered, because she meant what she said. "I've been willing since September," she said. "Possibly before that." "Before September?" She tilted her head slightly. "You fixed my gate. That was October, the first time," she said. "You fixed it the first time in the spring. You didn't say anything then either." He stared at her. "I notice things," she said, and picked up her pen. "Come for supper Thursday. Mrs. Doyle sets a good table." He came Thursday, and the Thursday after that. and most Thursdays that followed, through October and into November, and what he discovered in those evenings was this: Kathleen Hadley was the kind of person who made a room feel more itself. She didn't perform. She didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it. She read in the evenings while he talked to Mr. Doyle about the farm, and occasionally she would look up from her book and add something precise and dry to the conversation that changed the whole shape of it, and then go back to reading without ceremony. She was also, he learned, genuinely curious about his work, in a way that was not politeness. She wanted to know how he chose which wood, for which purpose, what made one joint stronger than another, why the grain direction mattered. She had opinions about it once she understood it, and her opinions were usually right, which he found out the one time he didn't listen to her suggestion about the angle of a roof support and had to adjust it 3 days later. "You knew," he said. "I thought so," she said. No gloating, just the fact. He fell in love with her the way some things happen in November, gradually, and then all at once, the way the cold comes, and then you look up one morning, and the ground is frozen, and you realize it has been for a while, and you just hadn't been paying attention. He asked her at the schoolhouse. In December, when the snow had come and the aspen trees were bare and the schoolyard was white and still. The children were gone. She was marking at her desk, and he had come to fix the sticking window latch. It had been letting in a draft, and when he was done, he stood there with his tools and looked at her in the winter light. He had thought about a grander setting. The ridge above town, maybe. The river bend where the ice made its particular sound. But when the moment came, it didn't feel right to dress it up. The schoolhouse was where she had answered him honestly when she could have deflected. It seemed right to come back. "Kathleen," he said. She looked up. He stood in front of her desk and said what he meant, in the way he had learned she preferred. Plainly, without ornamentation, without build-up that served only the speaker. "I know I was slow," he said. "I know you saw it before I did, and waited longer than was fair. But I see it now. I see you clearly. I would like to keep seeing you clearly for the rest of my life." He paused. Outside, the snow was coming down again, soft and steady. "I would like very much for you to marry me," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Her expression was something he had not seen before on her. Not the careful stillness she wore in public, not the dry amusement she used to keep things at a comfortable distance. Something underneath that. Open and decided, and without its usual defenses. "Jonas Whitmore," she said. "It took you a year." "It did," he said. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That is absolutely a yes." He put his mother's ring on her finger there beside the schoolhouse window with the December snow coming down outside. She looked at it for a moment, just a moment, with an expression that had nothing to do with the ring itself and everything to do with what it stood for. Then she looked up at him, and he kissed her in the quiet schoolroom, and the snow kept falling the way it always did in Alberta, indifferent and faithful and entirely unconcerned with the small, significant things happening inside warm buildings. The wedding was in April, when the snow was finally gone, and the Alberta sky had turned that particular shade of blue that only comes after a long winter. Half of Dunmore came. Kathleen wore ivory cotton, simple and clean, her mother's lace at the collar, nothing she didn't mean. She walked to him with her head up and her face entirely certain, and Jonas thought, "I cannot believe I was slow about this." Reverend Alcott, the old one, kept the ceremony short and well chosen. He had been waiting for this, he told Jonas afterward, for approximately 14 months, and was glad someone had finally come to his senses. Mrs. Doyle cried, the good kind of crying, that night in Jonas's house, their house with the new curtains Kathleen had chosen, and the east-facing window he'd put in the previous December, when he'd been building toward something he hadn't quite said out loud yet. She sat at the kitchen table with her hair down and her hands around a cup of tea and looked at him across the table with an expression that was new, settled. "Sure, we're going to be very happy here," she said. "I think we already are," he said. "You're learning," she said. The years that followed were made of ordinary things done with care. The schoolhouse got 2 new windows the second year, properly approved by the board this time, though Jonas had already measured for them the previous autumn. Kathleen started a small lending library in the back corner of the schoolroom, 12 books to start, borrowed and donated, growing to 40 by the third year. It was the kind of practical idea that served an obvious need, and people would still be talking about it a generation later without necessarily remembering whose idea it had been. Their first child came in the spring of the third year, a girl they named Frances, who arrived with strong opinions and her mother's quality of stillness when she was deciding something. Kathleen said she had Jonas's patience. Jonas said she had Kathleen's stubbornness. Both were true and would serve Frances well. Their son came 2 years after that. They named him Robert for Jonas's grandfather, who had built things in Ontario and passed along the habit. On a Wednesday evening, in the autumn of their 5th year, Jonas had begun to think Wednesdays simply were significant and had stopped trying to argue otherwise. He was replacing a board on the school fence when Kathleen came out with both children, Frances running ahead and Robert making his determined way behind at a pace that suggested great conviction if not great speed. She raised her hand when she saw him. He put down his tools and went to them. Later, when the children had worn themselves out and were leaning against their parents in the last of the afternoon light, Kathleen rested her head against his shoulder and said, "Do you remember what you said that first time?" At the door, "Luckiest man in the territory," he said. "You were right," she said. He looked at her. "I'm the lucky one." "We're both lucky," she said in the practical way she said true things. "We're both lucky," he agreed. The aspens had gone gold again. October, reliable as the work itself, reliable as the sound of the planes in the wind, reliable as the particular quality of light on the Alberta foothills in the last days before winter, Dunmore kept on being Dunmore, small and stubborn and full of people trying to build lives worth building. Jonas Whitmore held his family in the late afternoon light and understood, with the full weight of a man who knows what things cost, what he had almost let himself miss. He had been so practiced at not wanting things directly that he had almost walked past the one thing that mattered, not out of cowardice, just out of the kind of long habit that is easy to confuse with contentment. He was grateful, down to his bones, that a woman in a pale yellow schoolhouse had been honest when she didn't have to be, that she had carried what she felt quietly and without bitterness, and answered plainly when the moment came. That had taken more courage than anything he had done in that doorway. He knew that now. The greatest things are rarely hidden. They are usually right there, fixing a gate in the spring, bringing tea without being asked, noticing when a child can't see the chalkboard and doing something about it without waiting for permission. Doing the quiet, necessary thing and doing it without announcement, and being exactly who they are in plain sight. The hardest part is simply looking up from whatever you've been doing long enough to see them clearly. Don't wait a year. Don't wait 5. Whatever you have been not quite looking, for whatever careful, habitual, self-protective reason, look at it now. Thank you for being here today. Wherever you are listening from, I'm glad you came. Until next time.